So this is the 10 meter ham band. This is obviously Morse code. We're listening to CW. This is HA8LNN in Hungary. All right. Now, I know most of you aren't going to use Morse code, but I just wanted to demonstrate the abilities of HF radio. Now, 10 meters, which is the band we're on currently, is not always open, but it's open right now, and you can actually see all these signals on the waterfall here. Those are all different conversations happening, and I'll bet you if I spin this dial and listen to them, most of these are probably what are going to be called DX or long distance contacts. These are not going to be US contacts. A lot of them will be Europe. 10 meters is open to Europe right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about the HF radios today and things you might want to consider when we talk about HF radios. Because again, remember, HF radio is going to give us the ability for beyond line of sight communication. Like I said, that's Hungary we're listening to. All right. And I'm in New York. So that is why HF radio is so hugely powerful. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things you might want to think about when you buy an HF radio for emergency preparedness. We'll talk about base versus field radios, some of the cost and quality concerns, some power requirements, whether or not you need a waterfall, space and weight consideration, different modes, and then some accessories and things like that. Now, what I'm on right now, like I said, is the 10 meter ham band. So this is 28 megahertz. We're about to hear, I think somebody's about to call him. I can't hear who that is. Let's tune up and see what this is. This is big. That's the US calling somebody. Anyway, so let me talk about the 10 meter ham band for just a minute, okay? And there's a reason I want to talk about this band. We talked about bands and frequencies in our last video. One of the things you've got to understand about some of these bands is they are not always open. All right, so this is 10 meters, 28 megahertz. This is a daytime band, and it's only open certain times. It depends on the solar conditions and where we are in the solar cycle. We're at the top of the solar cycle right now, so 10 meters will be open on and off. Sometimes 10 meters is a line of sight band, so not much different than using a handheld we talked about before. However, when it's open, it's open. You can work the whole world on 10 meters, okay? But again, it's fickle. The reason I bring that up is I've had a lot of people in the comments talk about CB and how they wouldn't buy any of these radios. They would just buy a CB and call it a day. Now, there's some merit to that, but let me talk about why that might not be the best thing to do. Now, I'm not saying not to buy a CB radio. You can go ahead and buy a CB radio. That's not an issue. All right, but let's talk about CB for just a minute. CB is the 11 meter band. So it sits right in between the 10 meter band, which is this, and the 12 meter HF band, which is 24.5 megahertz roughly. And you can see this is open as well. This is not always open also. Now, I don't know where that is. All right, but 12 meters is 24 megahertz. 10 meters is 28 megahertz. The CB or Citizens band sits right in the middle. It's 11 meters. It's like, what, 26 megahertz, I think? Something in that vicinity. Now, there are some things you need to understand with CB. You're limited to 4 watts of power on AM and FM. Now, yes, people modify radios and make way more power than that, but the legal requirement is 4 watts on AM and FM, 12 watts for single sideband. So what single sideband is, if you took an AM broadcast, an AM transmission, and basically cut it in half right at the carrier and only listen to half of it, that's single sideband, all right? That's limited to 12 watts of power. Now, 4 watts and 12 watts doesn't sound like much. You can work all over the planet on 5 watts. I've worked countless countries around the world with a 5-watt radio. Now, granted, that's Morse code. That's not voice or what we call phone, but it's still doable. Now, here's the thing. Okay, so it's 40 channels. So it's channelized. There are 40 channels. It's very similar in propagation to the 12 meter and 10 meter ham band. There's no license requirement. It does have some antenna restrictions. I think it can be no more than 20 feet off of the roof of a structure, no more than 60 feet in the air. I think that's what it is. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a CB guy. I've used them, but it's not really my thing. However, the big problem with CB is it's very similar to the 10 meter or 12 meter ham band. And like I just said, these bands are not always open. They're only open every once in a while. If we're at the bottom of the solar cycle, or even at the top of the solar cycle, when conditions aren't correct for this to propagate, 12 meters and 10 meters aren't open. They're line of sight bands. If 12 meters and 10 meters isn't open, 11 meters isn't going to be open either. So thinking you're going to use a CB as your long distance communications tool all the time is not a realistic approach. When solar conditions are not appropriate, it's going to be a line of sight tool, just like our 2-meter walkie-talkie is. All right, so I just wanted to bring that up because I've had a lot of people talk about CB, and I agree, CB has a place, 100%. It's unlicensed, so anybody can use it, right? It does have the ability to propagate very long distances, but again, only at certain points in the solar cycle, and only when conditions are right. Yesterday, if I'd gone on 12 meters, it wasn't open. It is right now. Okay, so don't count on this to always work. Do not grab a CB and think you're always going to be able to get long-distance communications. You will not. Okay, so I'm not saying don't buy a CB. By all means, grab a CB. See how it works. I mean, like I said, it'll go even line of sight. You'll get, at a 12-watt radio, you can get 40, 50 miles, no problem. Okay, but remember, it's line of sight. So if you've got mountains or things in between you and who you're trying to talk to, it's not going to work. And there are no repeaters on on CB. Okay, so CB has its place. Just understand its limitations. It's got power limitations, that's got antenna limitations, and it has propagation limitations, very similar to the 10 and 12 meter ham band. Sorry about that. I'm tripping over my tongue today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the radios themselves. All right, so let's talk base station versus field radio. So what you're looking at here on my desk, this is a Yaesu FTDX-10. This is what would be considered a base station radio. Can you take it in the field? Absolutely. I have. In fact, I've got a carry handle on the side so I can take it into the field. However, this is not one of my primary field radios, and there are some major reasons for that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But generally speaking, when we talk about a base station radio, we're talking about a big radio that's going to require a big power supply. So you can see over there, I've got a power supply. All right. Down next to me charging, I have a 20 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery that I use with my 100-watt field radios. We'll talk about power in our next video because power considerations are going to be something you really have to consider. We'll talk about it briefly today when we talk about both current draw on transmit and receive. We'll get down more granular in the next video and talk about how to choose the right power solution for what you're trying to do. But this thing weighs 13 pounds. It is large. Okay, this is not a small radio by any stretch of the imagination, and it was not intended to be. Right? This is, for all intents and purposes, a base station radio. It's designed primarily to be used for, like in your house. Like I said, you can absolutely take it in the field, but it's not optimal for that. There are a lot of things about this radio that make it suboptimal for field use. Like I said, the size, it's massive. The weight, it's heavy. This thing is a power hog. Okay. I don't know. I'd have to look at my ammeter on my power supply and see what this thing draws on receive. Let's see what it says right now. Let me see. Whoops. We are drawing, I don't know, about 3/4 of an amp probably. All right. Just sitting here with the screen on, listening. All right. So this is drawing quite a bit of current just sitting here. I'm not keying up, right? I'm not transmitting. I'm simply sitting here. And it's drawing, it's hard to tell because it's an analog gauge and it's right at the bottom of the gauge. Someplace between 1/2 and 3/4 of an amp, just sitting here, okay? So when we're talking about a radio for emergency use, that's something you've really got to think about is how power hungry is that radio going to be? Not just on transmit. Because people will talk about, well, I'll buy a 100-watt radio and turn the power down. That's great. But how much power is it going to draw and receive? Because remember, if we're talking about radio for emergency use, we might not have a power solution for an extended period of time. We might be relying on solar panels to charge batteries. So we really need to consider even things as simple as receive current when we're trying to figure out what radio we want to use for this kind of situation. Okay. Now next to it over here, I've got my Emcomm IC705. This is a field radio. Right, this is a very small radio, comparatively speaking. It's not small compared to some of my other radios, but you will see that this radio is not very deep. It is in a cage to protect it because this is a fairly, you've got a touch screen and stuff on it, so you need to be a little careful with it. It can be a little delicate. But this, compared to this, so you can see how big that IC705 is compared to that FTDX10, they are completely different animals. So, this radio and this radio to serve two different purposes. This is an HF only radio. So this only works on, this will work from 6 meters to 160 meters. Well, 6 meters is technically VHF, but this will go 6 meters to 160 meters. This radio is all band, so this will do 70 centimeters to 160 meters. It won't do 1 1/4, but it'll do everything else in between. All right. This is a 100 watt base station radio. This, using the internal battery, is a 5 watt radio hooked up to an external battery or power supply. I've got it currently hooked up to a power supply right now. It is a 10 watt radio. So 10 times as much power on transmit. Now, that sounds like a big deal. Oh, we got a repeater identifying itself. 10 watts to 100 watts sounds like a big deal, right? This thing makes 10 times the power that does. So this thing should be able to transmit 10 times as far, right? Wrong. It's not linear. All right. So if you look on this screen, let me zoom in just a little bit here. You will see this S meter or this power meter. Okay, and you'll see it bouncing up and down. So right there, it's about a 5. Okay, so that signals an S5 or an S6 maybe. That signal strength meter tells me how strong the incoming signal is. Now here's the thing. In between each number, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, so on and so forth, is 6 dB. All right? If I double my power, so if I go 5 watts to 10 watts, it's only half an S unit on the meter. It's only 3 dB. All right, so 10 to 20, that's 3. 20 to 40, now we're up to a full S unit. 40 to 80 is another half. It's only 1.5 S units difference between that radio running 5 watts, or 10 watts, sorry, and this radio running 100 watts. So we're only talking the difference on this meter, 1.5. So like this guy right now is an S5, he'd be like an S7 or S7.5, maybe an S8. The difference between 10 watts and 100 watts. It's not linear. All right, every time you double your power, you increase half an S unit on your signal strength meter. That's it. So don't think you will not be able to talk to people on a low power radio. That is not the case. I'm going to talk about some radios here in a minute. I'm going to talk about how some of the distances I've worked people on these, and not even just Morse code. Yes, I'm a Morse code guy, which is way more efficient, but even voice, phone, I've talked to people all over the planet on these radios. All right, so that's something you need to consider, is that do I really need a full power 100 watt radio for emergency use? Like I said, something like this, I need a big power supply to power this thing that has enough current, not only to work when I'm transmitting, but on receive. And like I said, if this is hooked to a battery and we're on receive and it's pulling current all day long, it's going to suck that battery dry pretty fast. The current draw on that thing is way lower. And we're going to talk about some that are even lower. Okay. So let's look at some of the radios that you could possibly consider when we talk about radios for emergency use. And again, I'm primarily looking at this from the consideration of emergency power solutions. We've had a natural disaster and we're out of power for an extended period of time. You're stuck in the middle of nowhere and you've got limited power availability, those kinds of things. So this is a Yaesu I'm losing my mind, FT891. So this is a 100 watt field radio. So if you look at the size difference between these two radios, all right, you can see that 891 is vastly smaller. This is a field radio. It is a 100 watt field radio. So it puts out just as much power as my FTDX10 does. Now it's not quite as fancy. All right, the receiver's good, but it's not as good as the FTDX10. It doesn't have a waterfall. So when we're talking about a waterfall, we're talking about this screen right here. Okay, so there are two sides to this. Let me zoom back in. We have a waterfall and a pan adapter. Let me go to a different band and let me go to the phone portion or the voice portion of the band so you can see I don't want to do that. I just want to change my band stack. Let's go up to the voice portion. Okay.
Obviously, if you have an airport close by, you
okay.
don't want to,
so
you can reach it, you know,
this is 20 meters.
If the engine fails, you don't want to
this,
pass it by. That's for sure. That was a good,
this portion up here where you're actually seeing the current signal, that is called a pan adapter. All right. So this is where our signal starts. This is what's called upper sideband. Remember how I talked about single sideband before? We're only seeing half of this, right? Normally an AM signal would be both sides of the center line here. We'd have a carrier in the center. We've just got this upper portion, or the upper sideband. You can see USB right here. All right, so we're only looking at half of it. So this portion on top where we're seeing the real time is called a pan adapter. Down here on the bottom where you see the history of the signals, that is called a waterfall. Let me turn my level down just a little bit and clean that up just a little bit. There we go. So now if you look at that, you can see the history of what was happening. So if somebody's not currently transmitting, you can see on the screen where their signal was. See what else we can find on the band. 20 meters is usually pretty busy. Here we go. All right. So, do you need a waterfall and do you need a pan adapter? That. Do you need a pan adapter? Do you need a pan adapter? Do you need a waterfall? The answer to that is no. All right. You have a really good way to discern whether there's a signal or not here. It's on top of your neck. It's called your brain. It's got these things called ears that listen to sounds. You can tune up and down the band. I could cover this up, tune up and down the band, and listen for signals. In fact, that's probably a better way to do it because you will pull things out you will not see on the waterfall or the pan adapter. That being said, if you're looking for a strong signal, I've got an emergency and I'm like, oh crap, I need help. I'm just going to spin the dial till I see the strongest signal I can find. And I'm just going to key up and say break, break, break. And when they come back to me, I'm going to tell them I've got an emergency. Right? I can hear these guys loud as, clear as a bell. Same over here. I lost that one. So you can see how weak that signal is. You can just barely see them on the waterfall there. Okay? That sounds like maybe a park activation. So do you really need a waterfall or a pan adapter? No. All right. Are they nice to have? Yeah, especially if you're trying to find strong signals. So this radio does not have a pan adapter or a waterfall. It's just got a display on it that shows you the frequency and some other information. All right. This radio, to give you an idea of prices, that FTDX10 is about a $1,400 radio. That IC705 is also about a $1,400 radio. This Yaesu FT891 100-watt field radio is about $650. So if you want a 100-watt field radio, you really want to be able to reach out and touch someone, you can use this guy. And then I've had people say, well, I'll just buy a 100-watt radio, like I said, and turn the power down. The problem is this radio on receive draws a lot of current. All right? This is not a low-power radio, either in transmit or receive. Okay? So that's another, like I said, that's a consideration that you really need. Sorry, I'm bumping my phone here. I didn't mean to. That's something else you really need to consider is what is the receive current? This thing draws a lot of power on receive, but if you want a 100-watt field radio, this is probably the guy you want to buy. Okay, like I said, they're about $650. Now, from there, I'm going to go to what I consider to be the best all-around beginner's field radio you can buy, bar none. And that is the Xiegu G90. All right, this is the radio I recommend people buy when they ask what's the first HF radio I should buy. All right, this is not a huge radio, so let me get that 891 back up here. All right, so it is smaller than the 891, both in width and in, thickness. It's about the same depth. So this radio is 20 watts. All right, so that's kind of the sweet spot for a field radio I found is 20 watts. This is a 20 watt radio. It does have a waterfall and a pan adapter. It is very small, but it is very readable. If you want to see what any of the screens on any of these look like, I have a video on my channel that shows you what all the displays on these radios look like so you can see. This is an HF only radio, just like the FT891 is. Okay, so this is, I think this one's 10 to 160 meters. I don't think this does 6 meters if I remember correctly. This radio is reasonable current draw on receive. I forget, I measured it a long time ago. I don't remember what it was, but it was fairly reasonable. It's lower than the 100 watt radios were. This radio has some things that make it really good for a beginner. It has, like I said, it's a 20 watt radio. So we've got a little more power. It's got a fantastic internal antenna tuner in it. We'll talk about antenna tuners more when we get to antennas. Just understand that sometimes you need a tuner to get the antenna to work correctly. You don't just throw up a wire and go. There's a lot of math involved in figuring out how long the antenna needs to be. If you don't have a good match, the tuner in this thing will match that antenna so you don't damage the radio. Now, the thing you got to understand is with an antenna tuner, it makes the radio happy. It does not necessarily mean your signal is getting out of the antenna any better. In fact, it won't at all. It's going to attenuate some of that signal. But what it will do is keep the radio happy so that you don't burn the radio up. Okay, there's something called an SWR, all right, our standing wave ratio, which we'll talk about when we get to antennas. And we need to make sure that's an acceptable limit so we don't damage the radio. But this has a fantastic tuner in it. This thing will tune up just about anything. All right, it's fairly easy to use. There are a lot of buttons. Once you learn the menu structure, it's fairly easy. All right, none of these radios are easy to use. That's one of the things you've got to understand about these HF radios is even the easiest one to use is not very easy. They're not super intuitive. HF gets a little bit complicated, and every radio is different. So just because you've used this radio doesn't mean you can hop over to this Yaesu and just make it work. All right, they're very different from a menu structure standpoint. You know, it's not pick it up and go like it is basically with a walkie-talkie. These things are a whole different ball of wax. Okay, but the G90 is sort of my go-to when somebody asks, what should I buy? I'm new to this. What radio should I buy? This is the radio I'm going to tell you 9 times out of 10. 20 watts, awesome tuner, loudspeaker, waterfall and pan adapter, and this thing's like $400. All right, you can buy one of the. In fact, if you can buy these on Black Friday sales, they'll have them like $350 or $399, and it'll come with a bunch of accessories, stands and fans and all sorts of other gizmos. You can get these things really reasonable. So this would be my sort of ubiquitous answer when somebody says, what HF radio should I buy to begin with? I would say a G90. And this thing has been used and abused. You can see it's all the finish is worn off. It's all scratched up. This thing's been through the ringer. And it works. I've made thousands of contacts on this radio, and it just works. The new ones have a different, I think they come with power poles now maybe on the back. And they don't have this thinned aluminum bottom anymore. They have a bottom that's actually open, so they cool better. That's one of the things with these. They get hot. We'll talk about modes in a minute. Some of the modes will make these things heat up pretty well. Now, the other Xiegu radio I have here is the X6200. It's upside down. This radio is at all band, all mode. Well, it's not all band. It's HF, all mode. I think this has I'm pretty sure this has an internal. It does. It has an internal sound card for digital modes. It's got an internal battery. All right, the G90 doesn't, and the FT891 don't. Those have to be plugged into an external power source, a battery, whatever. This has an internal battery. This has got a really good internal tuner also. Now, this 6200 is about an $800 radio. Right, you can see how much smaller this is than the other two, though. This is I think these are 6 or 8 watts, I forget. So it's much lower. It's what we call QRP, or low power. All right. This radio is cool with one exception, and for me, this radio is garbage. This radio is awful if you do Morse code. The keyer in this thing is horrendously bad. With that being said, if you're using this for emergency use, the chances of you using Morse code for that are pretty low. I'm not saying you couldn't. You absolutely could. In fact, as a mode, Morse code or CW works really well when nothing else will get through. But that's neither here nor there. This radio, if you're going to do voice or digital, is a good option. Like I said, they're about $800. And like I said, it's got an internal battery, so you don't need to have an external battery source. Now, you can hook it up to external power right there. Okay, so you can bring a battery along as a backup, but this has an internal battery. Like I said, this also has an internal antenna tuner, and Xiegu's antenna tuners are really good. Okay, from here, let's go go to another 20 watt radio. This is a little bit more of an oddball. This is an FX4CR. This is made by a Chinese ham named BG2FX. He makes these. This is his baby. Okay, this is not like, this doesn't come out of some cheap factory in China. This is not one of those what they call cheap Chinese radios. This is a fantastic radio. Just because he was Chinese doesn't mean this radio is garbage. He did a phenomenally good job on this radio, and he is very responsive to his customers as far as things like features and bugs are concerned. He takes care of that stuff. The new versions of these have rails on them to protect the encoders. They have a fan to cool them because these will get hot because it is such a little radio, and this is a 20 watt radio. All right, if you look at the size of that compared to the G90, these are both 20 watt radios. It's not even, I put these little legs on, they don't come on it. It's not even a contest. All right. Now, this radio, the 6200 has a very good screen with a very good waterfall and pan adapter. I didn't mention that. This radio also has a very clear, very crisp waterfall and pan adapter. It is small, but it's very easy to read. I think this radio, if I remember correctly, is 80 meters to 10 meters. No internal tuner, no internal battery. However, this radio does Bluetooth digital. So when we talk about digital modes here in a minute, we're going to talk about the different modes. If you're going to do digital modes, which are really good in emergency situations, this radio can do them via Bluetooth from your phone. You don't even need a wire. All right. That 705 is a fantastic radio for digital. Even that won't do what this will do. This thing is sick. All right. You can, and it'll do digital over USB, or it'll do digital over Bluetooth. These are about, I think these are $450 or $500. They're hard to get. You got to kind of sign up for it on his website, and when he makes a batch, you can get them. They take a while to get. This is an excellent radio, and you can see how small this is. And it is built like a tank. This thing is a solid brick of aluminum. This thing is a bruiser. When I got this thing, I was just blown away with the quality of this thing. The build quality of this is exceptional. I've only got one radio here built better than this, okay? This thing is very, very good. So if you're looking for a little tiny field radio, 20 watts, all mode, all your HF bands, this guy's hard to beat, especially for the price. Like I said, they're hard to get. That's the downside. All right? So that's the FX4CR. Now, we're going to get a little more expensive here. So this is an Elecraft KX2. This is my favorite field radio. All right. This is an 80 meters to 10 meters HF radio. This is a QRP radio, so this is a 10 watt radio. All right. This does not have a waterfall or a pan adapter, but it does have a very large, very easy to read display. This radio is very, very expensive. These new are about $1,600 for a shack in a box, which is what this is. And they don't come with these rails. These rails and the heatsink, those are aftermarket. Those are from Pro Audio Engineering. This radio has a phenomenal antenna tuner in it. It's on par. It's probably the only one that's close to this. The G90 has a tuner in it that's as good as this. Other than that, the tuner in this thing is incredible. The receiver in this is very good. The filtering is very good. This is not the kind of radio probably a beginner is going to buy unless you can get a screaming deal on it. These are kind of finicky to use. You can see it's quite small. So if I get the 6200 up here, which would sort of be designed similarly, all right, it's bigger. It's also half as expensive. All right, but you can't really compare the two. The receiver in this Elecraft is light years better. They're hard. These are hard to get. There's a wait list. You know, I forget what the current wait time is. It was up to like some stupid nonsense, like I don't know, 4 or 6 months. I think it's down to like a month or two now. But if you're looking for like a phenomenally good field radio and you've got the money, this is hard to beat. This probably isn't what most of you are going to buy though. But again, all the HF bands except for 160 meters, phenomenal tuner, phenomenal filtering, phenomenal receiver. All right, this is my favorite field radio. Okay, 2 more radios I want to talk about, and then we'll talk about some of the other things you need to consider. This is a Lab 599 Discovery TX500. This is the toughest field radio you can buy, period, full stop, end of story. These are Russian. Now, the new ones, the ones you currently buy in the United States, are not made in Russia. They're made in the UAE. This is one of the old Russian ones. Okay, this is one of the early radios. You can see made in Russia right there. This thing is literally a solid brick of billet aluminum. It is water resistant. It is tough as nails. This is 160 to 6 meters, if I remember correctly. This is about 10 watts, although on certain bands I've seen as high as 16 watts. pan adapter, not a waterfall, but it's a monochrome pan adapter. It's very easy to read in the sun. This radio has both these radios, both the KX2 and the TX500 have extremely low current draw. Like we're talking like 100 milliamps of current draw. All right. Like a tenth of an amp or less on receive on these things. All right. This radio, I didn't look what these are currently going for. These are usually about $1,100 or someplace in that vicinity. You can find them used sometimes for about $800. If you're looking for the toughest field radio you can buy, go find one of these and call it a day. This will be the toughest radio you can find. However, the chips in these, if you're not careful, you can fry the chips in these radios, and they are like the power supply. The power supply is what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. Anyway, the internals on this you got to be careful with because they don't make the chip for this radio anymore. So if you fry them, it takes a while to get them fixed. There are stocks of them, but that's one thing you got to watch. You want to make sure your SWR is reasonable. You don't want to be trying to transmit into a radio or into an antenna with a really high SWR. But as far as build quality is concerned, this radio is the best built field radio I own. And you can see how thin this thing is. Like if I hold this up compared to the KX2, all right, it's tiny. They're coming out with a man pack type radio as well soon, which will be ridiculous also. But if you're looking for the toughest field radio, this is the guy. All right. Now, the last radio I've got here, if you are on a wicked tight budget and you just need something that will work, although it's not exactly the greatest thing on earth, go get yourself a true SDX. This is I think these are 5 bands. This is, I think, 80, 60, 40, 30, 20. You can get them with different band stacks. That's what this one is. You can see how tiny this is. It's in a 3D printed case. These are about a 5-watt radio. The audio quality on these is not very good. The filtering is pretty bad. However, they work. And it's got a very good internal microphone. I worked Cuba and the Dominican Republic on single sideband voice, not digital, not Morse code, but voice. Push the talk button, talking to that little microphone. I worked both Cuba and the Dominican Republic on this little bitty radio running a little tiny battery bank and a piece of wire, okay? No internal tuner, all right? But if you're on a budget, these are about $130, something like that. Complete, you can buy those kits for like $80. Again, like I said, the audio quality on these is pretty bad and the filtering is atrocious. But if you just need something just in case and you don't want to spend a ton of money, this will work. Is it optimum? No, but it'll get the job done. Okay. A couple other things you want to consider. So we talked about our different field radios and things. I've got a lot of other field radios, but those are the ones that I kind of thought people might consider. We talked about cost and quality, power requirements. Remember, a big 100-watt radio is going to need a big battery. These little QRP low power radios are going to use much smaller batteries. We're going to talk about power in my next video, and we'll talk about current draws and duty cycles and power requirement and calculators and things like that. All those kinds of things you need to take in consideration. But a field radio generally is going to have much lower power requirements because it's lower power on both transmit and receive. Okay, we talked about waterfalls and pan adapters, space and weight considerations. Obviously, some of these radios are huge. That FTDX10 is massive, right? This weighs a couple of ounces, right? Most of these field radios are not very heavy and they don't take up a lot of space. Modes, there are 3 basic modes you need to consider. There's what's called phone, that's voice. Well, that's what you think of when you think of radio. There's digital. Digital is going to be computer to computer or phone to phone. Some digital modes are better than others for emergency communications. The most popular digital mode is called FT8. That is not what I would use for an emergency. That's more just quick contact kind of stuff. But things like, we'll talk about some of these programs in subsequent videos, but things like WinLink, which is email over RF, JS8 call or Vera AC, those are both conversational modes, would work really well. The thing you've got to remember about some of those digital modes is that there's nobody on listening when you start typing, right? There's nobody to get a hold of. With something like WinLink, I can send an email from my radio with no infrastructure to a node someplace else in the country that'll inject it into the internet and deliver that email to whoever I want. You can also do peer-to-peer email. So I could fire up WinLink on this. I could hook my laptop up, open WinLink, and I could send a peer-to-peer email from this radio to another radio with no infrastructure in between. Okay, so if you need to pass a lot of traffic, digital is the way to go because you just type everything in, hit send, and it sends the entire package. Okay, and then there's Morse code. Morse code is very, very efficient for this kind of stuff because it's very power efficient. It's very bandwidth efficient. It's not as efficient as digital, but I don't need any external devices. I don't need a computer. I don't need a phone. Okay, the downside with Morse code is two things. One, both people need to know Morse code. Right now, I'm proficient at it, but a lot of people are not for obvious reasons. And two, it's slow to send information on Morse code. When we speak, we talk about 100 to 120 words a minute. On Morse code, a really fast operator will be in the 40 word a minute range. I operate in the mid 20s. Okay, so it takes longer to pass traffic, but it will work. I heard Morse code CW nets during Hurricane Helene transmitting. They were relaying information in and out through those nets. Okay. Now, some other accessories we want to consider: external tuners. So some of these radios don't come with antenna tuners. So let's suppose you break your wire antenna. Uh-oh, it was resonant. It worked on my radio without a tuner, and now it doesn't. You might need a tuner. Now, some of these radios have internal tuners. So like the KX2 or the Shager radios, those have internal tuners. I don't need to worry about it. But if I don't have an internal tuner, one of these external tuners might be the way to go. Now, I've got two tuners here. This ATU10 is an auto tuner. You just hook this up, you turn it on, you key up the radio, and it tunes up. But this requires power. This has a battery inside. Now, the battery in this thing lasts months and months and months. But it does require power. This is a Z-match tuner, so this does not require power. I have two variable capacitors here that I turn to change the capacitance to tune the antenna, okay? I don't need any external power source for this. So if you want a tuner that doesn't require batteries, doesn't require power, buy a Z-match tuner, throw this thing in your pack. These are both what are called QRP tuners. These are only good for like 10 watts. These will handle a little bit more, maybe 15. You wouldn't want to go any higher than that. You'll burn them up. All right, but like I said, no power. It is kind of finicky though, all right? Uses power much easier, all right? So an external tuner might be something you want to consider. The other thing you might want to consider is if you're going to do digital modes and you don't have a radio like this FX4CR that's got an internal sound card, or that FTDX10 or that 705, those have internal sound cards. I don't need any other interface between the radio and the computer. But if I'm using a radio like, for instance, say my TX500, and I want to do digital modes on it, I can't natively do that. I need another device. So for instance, this is called a DigiRig. This little guy is a sound card. So on one side, we have our audio and our serial from our radio. So I have cables that go into the radio. So you can see over here, I've got my data. All right. And then I've got my what's called CAT. That's my computer automated tuning that controls the frequency on the radio. Those plug into the side of the DigiRig. The other side has a USB that goes into your computer, and this acts as the sound card between your radio and the computer. So when the computer keys up, this guy sends the signal out of this radio, out into the air, and when I receive, the radio sends it through the sound card, through the USB, into the computer where it's demodulated. Okay, so you may need an external digital device if you have a radio that does not have an internal sound card. All right, if you have any questions about any of these radios, I have all sorts of videos on my channel with these radios in them. I have a lot of information about them. If you have any specific questions about any of the specific radios I talked about today, by all means, feel free to ask. Okay, I will do my best to answer them. But like I said, those are some of the things we really need to consider. Like I said, CB, absolutely take a look at CB. Just understand its limitations. You're going to hear people say, just buy a CB. Well, that's great. But for instance, if I'm trying to work regional communications in a disaster and I need to talk to people in neighboring counties or across the state, CB is useless. 100% of the time it's useless, unless I'm relaying one person to the next. A 40 meter or 60 meter or 80 meter HF radio, that'll do it. When we talk about antennas, we're going to talk about something called NVIS or near vertical incident skywave. You'll see how we can do that, all right? I can't do that on CB, all right? Like I said, consider your base versus field. If this is an emergency radio, a base radio like my great big FTDX10 right here probably is not the guy we want to buy. Will it work? Yeah. Is it going to be optimum? No, because it's power hungry and it's huge. All right. Cost and build quality. Obviously, the better the radio, the more it's going to cost, generally speaking. Right. Like I said, there's a world of difference in quality between this True SDX and this TX500. This is a $130 radio. This is an $1,100 radio. All right. So obviously, there's going to be a roll there. However, there are some happy mediums. Like I said, the G90, $450, excellent radio for the money. This is kind of the sweet spot for beginners. Like I said, if you just want a one and done solution, go buy a G90, call it a day. This could be your only HF radio. You could use this as a base station radio. You could use it as a field radio. In fact, for a year, this was dual duty. This was my base station radio and my field radio. All right, it will do everything. Like I said, power requirements. Do we need a big battery? Do we need a power supply? And again, we're going to cover some of those things in more specifics in the next video. Do we need a waterfall or pan adapter? Not necessarily. We can spin the dial and listen to strong signals. But like I said, it's nice in an emergency. If I'm just trying to reach somebody, I can look on this waterfall and go, whoa, dude, I can see these great big strong signals here. All right. So this is actually a park. When she comes back, you'll hear her.
Thank you for the contact.
There she is. All right. So like I said, if I had an emergency, I would just key up. I'd go break, 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 and when they came back to me, I'd give my call sign. If I don't have a call sign, I'm just going to say, hey, it's an emergency. I need help. This is where I am. This is what I need. All right. Space and weight, like I said, if it's something you're going to throw in a backpack, obviously one of these big 100-watt radios is probably not what you want. Modes. Will the radio do what you want it to do? Will it do voice? Will it do digital? Will it do Morse code? I've got Morse code only radios. That is not a great emergency radio, right? I'm not going to grab a Morse code only radio as my only emergency radio for obvious reasons. And last, do I need any other accessories? Tuners. Do I need digital interfaces? Things like that. Okay, so keep those things in mind when you go out to buy yourself an HF radio for emergency communications. All right. At the end of the day, any of the radios I showed you will get the job done. Some are better than others, right? If you want one radio that will literally do everything, that's 705. All band, all mode, waterfall, pan adapter. I have the waterfall turned off right now because I don't care about that on VHF, but this will do literally everything. Internal battery does not have an internal tuner though. Okay, but this little ATU-10, this guy directly interfaces with that radio. There's a jack on the back that plugs in the radio, so I don't even need to push any buttons. It just tunes automatically. But that's like a $1,400 radio, and it is a little fragile, okay? So, like I said, keep those things in mind when you go out to buy yourself an HF radio for emergency use. You know, how light does it be? How light does it need to be? How big does it need to be? What are your power considerations? You know, what modes are we going to run? All of those different kinds of things. What bands will the radio operate on? Right? If you've got a radio that only operates on the higher bands, 10 meters, 12 meters, 15 meters, 17 meters, and we're at the bottom of the solar cycle, that radio is useless. Okay? So keep some of those things in mind. Like I said, in subsequent videos here, we will be talking about, the next one we'll be talking about power considerations. And the following one, we'll be talking about antennas. Antennas is complicated on HF. All right, so we're going to spend some time. That might even be more than one video. We'll see. But if you have questions about radios for emergency, HF radios for emergency use in general, leave your questions or comments in the comment section below. If you have any questions about any of the radios I actually showed today, feel free to ask. Like I said, there are all sorts of videos on my channel talking about various radios I own and radios that have been lent to me. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of food for thought when you go out and consider buying an HF radio for field use. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about these radios before I sign off is, like I said, unlike a VHF walkie-talkie where you just key up and talk, this takes practice. You don't just hop on an HF radio, key up and go. You need to know what band are we supposed to be on at what time of day? Where are people going to be in the frequency space, right? I need to make sure I'm in the right portion of the band to work the mode I'm trying to work. There are a lot of things that go into that. Propagation is fickle. So like I said, 10 meters is open right now. Later today, it might not be, okay? So all of those things take a lot of time to learn. So what I would recommend is if this is something you're really serious about, if you want to be able to reach out and touch somebody in an emergency from across town to across the world, HF is going to be the tool you're going to want. Get on the air and practice. even something as simple as doing parks on the air or summits in the air. Hunt some parks from home. That way you'll learn, what bands can I hear people on at what times a day? Where am I hearing them? Sometimes there will be pipelines to certain places. Like yesterday, man, North Carolina sounded like it was sitting next to me. Okay. So take those things into consideration. This takes practice. This takes time. So again, if you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I really do appreciate everybody watching. I appreciate all the support I've gotten so far on this series. I do have some more UHF, VHF videos in the pipeline. I have some radios incoming that I'm going to talk about. I've had some people ask about some specific radios. So I've got some radios on the way. When I get those radios, I'll shoot videos on them. So at any rate, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, as always, 7-3.